Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, End-to-End Governance from Killing File Shares to Future-Proofing Digital Information. We have a great presentation lined up for you today, and we're excited that you're able to join us. So just some housekeeping rules before we begin. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with participants within 48 hours, so you can expect that on Thursday or Friday. Please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box at any time. We will do a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar, and we will answer as many as we can. Any questions that we don't get the time to answer during the webinar, we will reply to them via email. That's all I have, so I'm going to turn it over to our three presenters to introduce themselves. Scott?
Great, Annalisa, thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, hi everybody. I gotta love this modern technology, how we can get 100 or plus like-minded individuals together in a room when we're all coming to you from all so far away. I'm Scott Burt with Integra. I'll do more on myself in a moment, but first, let me introduce my co-presenters. Rich Hale, I'm flattered to have you on the line here, Chief Technology Officer at Active Navigation, and coming up to us today from, I believe you said Gate C13 at the Atlanta airport. So Rich, say hi and please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It's T13, Tango 13. It's a great place for everybody who would like to visit. And apologies in advance should my audio background noise come over. I'm going to try and manage that as best I can. Anyway, thanks for the intro, Scott. As a CTO of Active Navigation, I got involved in information governance 15 years ago. And since then, I've been building technologies to help organizations understand their unstructured data at scale. And I think that's the fundamental position that from which we should start. You can't do anything with your data unless you understand it. And I'll talk more about that on my piece later on.
Great, thanks. And tell us about your military background too. Just say something about that.
Oh, Scott, I'm so shy on that one. No, it's a good point. Thank you. I'm an aircraft engineer, professional aeronautical engineer in my roots, but I got into information governance and the whole data problem when I became the lead for a 700,000 user migration in the Royal Air Force and the Ministry of Defence in the UK. And from my perspective, whenever anyone is engaged in any type of migration activity, be it infrastructure or whatever, you've got to keep in mind that the asset is the information in that situation. And when I was considering my role as developing policy and concepts for this migration, I couldn't get around the fact that the information was the thing we had to take care of. And what I was stunned by was that my colleagues hadn't planned for how to understand that data, get their arms around it so that they could effectively manage it through the migration process. That's how I started off engaging in this problem and how I got engaged with Active Navigation. And I've been there ever since, as I said, building out these technologies.
That's great, Rich. Thank you. And I'm flattered also to have Mike Quinn, the CEO of Preservica, coming to us live from Boston today. Mike, say hi. Introduce yourself.
Hi, Scott. Hi, Rich. This is Mike. Yes, I'm in sunny Boston today. The accent belies the fact that I'm based here in the US. I'm the CEO of Preservica, and we're specialists in active digital preservation. And I've been doing this for about 7 or 8 years, very involved in helping the folks we work with think about long-term records and why you need to preserve information for the long term. So a lot of folks really understand this already. If you're in the business of looking after digital content for a long time, folks like National Archives and government institutions, they really get this, and we've been helping those organizations for some time. But interestingly now, we're talking to a lot of businesses that have critical corporate records that need to be retained, potentially for decades. And so this is an area that is near and dear to my heart. I'm looking forward to talking on this webinar about end-to-end governance.
Great, great. Thanks, Mike. And I'm Scott Burt. I'm the CEO of Integro. And I've been doing this information game for 23 years now with Integro, and we help clients across the US and Canada with information governance, content management challenges around modernization, content cleanup and analysis, and enrichment with machine learning and stuff like that. And so we're heavily a consulting and services and advisory partner around both technology and information governance. And our friends and partners here with Active Navigation and Preservica represent key tools and assets here for our clients to achieve their goals in end-to-end governance, which happens to be, guess what, the title of our slide today. And so we're going to be able to tell you anything we want to tell you because they're our own opinions and not the opinions of our firms. We have a disclaimer. I think Elon Musk needs that on his Twitter account, right? Agenda, we're going to talk about end-to-end governance, kind of what is that, and your biggest challenges. And we believe, by the way, we grabbed this, we took this analogy and metaphor. You might hear this a lot in telecom and cable television or internet connectivity. They can build that big pipe, maybe between Boston and Atlanta, but then getting to every household is that last mile, as they call it in the telecom world. And the same thing kind of applies here with information governance in this analogy of that first mile of how do we get the information into the system and classify it appropriately? And then the last mile, how do we keep it long-term, properly preserved, and actively updated and maintained long-term? So that is the theme here, is that first and the last mile today. And it's going to involve how do you value your content and take action on it? And then there with Mike with Preservica, future-proofing, isn't that a cool word? Digital assets. And we're going to talk about your content journey and close with some key takeaways. We've got 1 hour today. We've got good speakers. And so hopefully you'll be learn something and we'll have a good time here together today. End-to-end governance, I think Annalise or Neve put this together, the little Russian nesting dolls. Why is end-to-end governance so important? And I was just mentioning that before. Most of what we have seen in our experience in helping companies, large and small, and most of them are kind of good mid-sized, a few thousand employees on up. But the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges is that first mile of working with the end user. And nowadays, we no longer have a pool of typists or data entry people like we did 50 or 80 years ago. I miss that generation. And now we have this world where everybody is a content creator, even though I'm in hotel rooms and airports and that kind of thing. Everybody in your company is a content creator, and where they put things and how they classify things and that kind of thing is so important in then being able to properly govern that long term. So that first mile, and then of course that last mile, that valuable content. So your inspection diagrams for a pipeline, like we experienced in San Francisco, where the pipeline blew up and then they couldn't produce the records, right? Oh yeah, they were inspected and all the welds. Yeah, sure they were, right? Well, it's so important to have those critical assets, like Rich said. These information assets are truly assets, and we need to maintain them as such. Now, an interesting thing also in the first mile, I mentioned assets. Some of them have negative value, and you don't want to have them around. So we do a lot of, in that first mile, also figuring out what you don't want to keep. So it really is important on both sides of that. So in that first mile, we got to go to those systems of engagement where your users are spending their day. So they're creating and saving files into their file shares. And maybe you're on the bandwagon and you've already gotten rid of your file shares. And now you're just using file sync and share. Likely you're using both. Then you have SharePoint is a very common repository. Email locations is so much content, of course, created there. And Lotus Notes is another repository there. This is just a few, folks, of the first mile where that content is created and maybe touched by one of your employees once and maybe never again. And then you probably have in the middle, I should have started in there, the records management solution. You're on this call because you're interested in information governance and you already have investments in that area. You probably already have a records management system in there. You might, and whether that's in place or moved to manage. In place meaning we're governing the email or the content right in your email system or other place, or if it's moved to manage. But then you've also got this long-term records and digital preservation for those long-term assets that you need to maintain. So that's what we're talking about here for the last mile as well. And it gets blurry. Of course, there's exceptions to all these where things start and end. Now here are funnel. We actually inverted the funnel. I hope you don't mind, because we felt what comes out of the bottom of the funnel is most valuable, and plus a lot of charts. We have it at the bottom here, the collaboration, file shares, file sync and share. That's where you're going from vast volumes of content up through active records management, and then some of that content is going to be that long-term records preservation. So those assets around maybe your plants and infrastructure, life insurance, things like that are long-term. First mile. So chances are that content created by one of your thousands of content creators, employees, that content probably doesn't have good metadata. They probably didn't store it correctly in a file structure, et cetera, with a proper taxonomy, and likewise not classified. And so it becomes pretty just raw, right? You got that Word document, PowerPoint, PDF, drawing, CAD drawing, things like that, and vast volumes, oftentimes duplicated content. And nowadays, so important with the California Consumer Privacy Act, the GDPR, and the dozen or more regulations that are soon to be at your doorstep, all that sensitive PII, personally identifiable information. How do we identify that value at risk? And then there's a huge need to clean it up, because so much of it we don't need. As one study says, 67% of the content in your file shares you don't need to have. And I want you just to pause for a minute. I know some of the names on the list here are heads of IT that are joining us today. Think about what your costs are for storage and how many hundreds of terabytes you're storing in file shares sometimes. And content cleanup. This is what that file shares, your content repositories look like. And you've got risky data in the red here. You've got various kinds of data, some of it valuable that you want to retain, a lot of it you want to reduce. So we go through as Integro, this is what we're doing a lot of nowadays, is content analysis and then cleanup to get rid of the sensitive data, apply governance to that content of value. And you end up with a much smaller footprint with metadata added and then properly governed and controlled through the process. So ROT, you've probably all heard this metaphor, redundant, outdated, and trivial. Risky, outdated, trivial, I like as well. We have a methodology and a process to take clients through to help figure out with high confidence. So there's a lot of file types and rules that we can apply, and we know just it's fall out of your chair obvious. This is high confidence ROT, and we can take action on that in kind of bulk and help clean up systems there using tools like active navigation here. And then you've got a little more of the gray area, medium confidence, where we might want to quarantine and then delete after 6 months, and it will have some business review, still a little bit more in bulk there. And then down here, low confidence, this is the ROT that it requires more effort to determine if it's ROT, and you also have to have that cost benefit of how worth it is it to figure out if it is ROT or that kind of thing. So we have high, medium, and low. We've done whole webinars just on this topic alone. So today we're just going to kind of introduce it, that we've got approaches and methodologies using these tools to help you do that analysis and clean up at that first mile of that legacy content that's sitting around in your sync and share systems and file shares and email and the like. I'm going to be handing off here to Mike here first with the first mile, I'm sorry, the last mile. Mike, I'm going to pull you in and chat with us here on this, please.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I think we kind of switched analogies a little bit, and the last mile is like the last mile in a marathon, I guess. You start the race, and you hope you can make it to the last mile. Well, most of us hope to do that. And you touched on a point about how in any information management journey you end up with some records and some information that you do want to retain for a long time. Now, the kind of accepted duration for what constitutes long-term records is, I guess, anything over 10 years. A lot of information has, information retention periods of up to 7 years for emails, for example. But there's a lot of records that need to be kept for long term. And this slide here shows that when you ask practitioners, and this is actually from the Information Governance Initiative, a study they conducted, when you ask information governance practitioners, why do you keep long-term information? Why is it important? The spin wheel here kind of shows that there's various reasons why it's important to an institution. Anything from statutory, regulatory, and legal reasons to human resources, contracts, litigation support, and so on. But the bottom line on this is that information is important both to retain, to realize value for your institution, but also to mitigate risk. Now, one of the challenges is, although this information is pretty useful, if you move on to the next slide, please. Have you got control there? Although this information is pretty useful and vital to the organization, technology obsolescence becomes a risk. And if you're looking at any organization now, technology refresh cycles seem to be getting more and more frequent. In fact, on average, technology refresh cycles happen about every 5 years or so. And this same research report from the IGI discovered that 98% of organizations do keep long-term records for a decade or longer, but over 97% of information managers are aware that information can be lost over time. And this is something that's pretty well understood by the analysts. In fact, this morning I was speaking to an analyst, actually, or we were speaking to an analyst who talked about the concept of digital fragility, which I really like, the term digital fragility, that information becomes fragile over time. And then next slide, please, Scott. If you start applying this to where organizations are, we've had computer systems now for 30 or 40 years. So not only is this a forward-looking problem, but most organizations will have an accumulated risk from several decades of computer technology that's already around. And this shows that no matter which industry you're in, whether it's energy, pharma, public sector, or financial services, and you look at the regulations that apply to those industries, it's easy to see how you might need to retain records for decades or even permanently. And these are just some examples of the sort of digital records where, unless you have an active strategy for preservation, these things are at risk. So back to you, Scott.
Thanks, Mike. Absolutely, and oil and gas is an industry that has a lot of records and an important area. And in Rich, you've got a particular case study here, and we'll tee off your conversation here on more about the first mile. Can you jump in, Rich?
Yeah, sure, Scott, thanks. And I think it's important here that talking about a case study is a key piece, at least in the way I like to talk about this situation, because it's good to get from the abstract to the real. So this case study here is for a downstream oil and gas company. Interestingly, you can see we can't put the name on the slide, and it was fascinating. We spoke to the company, they're a customer of ours, about this, and they were really cool to share their learning, but the problem they had is that their legal team were concerned that it revealed that they had poor information practices and therefore would cause them some sort of liability or similar remedy. And so they elected for us not to share their name. It doesn't denigrate, though, from what I think is a really interesting case study. And so let me carry on with that. As you can see on the slide, not an enormous company. I think the data has been increasing since the case study was done, and it's probably double that now, but definitely a very active company. And the key point here is that they were going through the type of change that Mike mentioned earlier. Mike described technology obsolescence in a 5-year cycle or so. These guys were going through not only the standard technological obsolescence process, but also they were engaged heavily in mergers and acquisition. What that gave them was a continually changing information landscape, like all businesses. And they recognized that they were in a constant state of creating new legacy data, or at least potentially creating new legacy data. And like all organizations, there comes this point where they kind of realize that just creating new legacy information to sort of wither on the vine rather than being actively preserved or protected and promoted through the business on an ongoing basis wasn't a sustainable position. And so they came to the situation that I tried to describe in my introduction, which is they needed to understand the data they had, which is when they engaged our company, Active Navigation. And I guess I didn't do such a good description of it in my intro, and I will do now. They engaged us because our software is designed to provide them insight into their data wherever it lives. And we were talking about the last mile. There are two parts, sorry, the first mile. There are two parts to the first mile in my book. First of all is that understanding piece, understanding where the data is, what it's comprised of, and what typifies it, what's risky, what's trash or rot, as you were saying earlier, Scott, and also the types of policies that you need to execute on the data in order to define its value, define the risk, and enable you to actively and appropriately dispose of it. And at that point, I make it very clear, disposition has long been a well-practiced and appropriately used record management term. For us, we engage in information across the entire business, information in the wild, information on file shares and emails, and all those systems, Scott, you presented, plus record management systems as well. And in all situations, the business has policy obligations on that data, and also disposition obligations on that data too, to dispose of it in the appropriate fashion. And for those that aren't record managers, let me make clear that disposition is as much about retention and long-term preservation. That last mile, just trip back, please, if you could, please, Scott. That last mile that Scott was that you were talking about, Mike, as well as it's just as much about the preservation of the data as well as the actual deleting of the data. And we have customers who do both. They use our software to discover where the data is, dispose of it in terms of deleting it when it's of no value, but also classifying it and promoting it or preserving it for retention. Anyway, the key message from this particular slide is the company engaged in understanding what its policy should be. It acquired software to help the organization understand. And the other thing they did was they stood up a team, and I think this is quite important, that you always need people to carry forward and manage what becomes an expertise in the business. The expertise of being able to help organizations describe and understand their data, I think, is a key feature, or should be a key feature, in any governance program. And what these guys very quickly learned is they set up a very small team. They did it off their own dime, and they did it with full-time staff. The alternative could be to, we've seen other organizations employ third-party consultancies, such as, for example, Integro, your organization, Scott. But whatever, you need people who are going to bring some experience, some expertise, and develop the practices needed to continue to deploy and enable business leaders, the business functions, to understand their data and take action on it. So now let's go on to the next stage. Next slide, Scott. What the team realized is that they got involved initially through having to decommission a legacy LiveLink deployment, OpenText LiveLink. And they needed our software to help them understand the data that was in LiveLink, classify it, tag it up, and then migrate it. And they engaged in that process and developed a sort of a checklist, things that they commonly had to do with all their data. They went through that process with LiveLink, and then they got engaged by another business unit. That business unit was concerned about identifying data for legal collection and legal hold. And they recognized the same principles stood for that project as well. Then came another project, which was about identifying assets. In the oil and gas industry, you talk about the industry assets such as the oil rigs, the oil fields, and the like, and the data associated with their build and their safety, for example. And so they wanted to identify that data and preserve it and label it so it could be leveraged by the business. Again, they need to understand the data, classify it in some way so it can be appropriately tagged and organized, and in this case, migrated to a SharePoint repository. In all cases, the first stage was deploying a capability that enables them to understand the data and ultimately organize the data and present it in a way that let them take action. And as I said earlier on, that action could be anything from a quarantine to a delete to a migration to a long-term preservation. And I just thought it was helpful to put up the common questions they were asking each of their business customers. And they're sort of core parts of the first mile, and also questions that should be continually, Scott, you have a notification on your screen there. questions that continually should be applied to data across the board. First of all, does the company need to keep it? This concept of ROTS, redundant, obsolete, trivial, or e-trash, I often like to call it. And when you're talking about a file share, there's an enormous amount of that just hanging around. Scott gave 2 examples earlier on about obsolete and backup files, and we often find obsolete media files, personal media collections, allocated storage which hasn't been used. They're all examples of storage that can be disposed of and either for reduction in storage costs or reduction for backup or business continuity costs too. Does it have business value? There are 2 sides to that coin. Business value is any content that generates some sort of revenue or knowledge for the business. The flip side is that poorly managed valuable data can expose the business to risk as well. And let me give you a good example. An employee contract is a valuable piece of business data, but if it's not appropriately stored or protected, it becomes risky, especially under the regulations that we will hear so much about today. And so again, the job of what they were doing is discovering this data and enabling each of their business customers to respond to these points. Duplications, another point, is another example of redundant data. Data sensitivity, particularly around privacy regulations, but also things like intellectual property. Has the data been subject to some degree of preservations for legal hold? Now, in an email environment where you're using a kind of a user-based hold system, that's a reasonably straightforward question. But in an unstructured data store, you need to have some sort of insight into the data in order to determine whether it's potentially responsive to a legal hold. And then lastly, we've already touched on this, and Mike will talk in much more detail about this later on. Does it have some sort of long-term retention archival applicability to? Let's move on to the next slide, please. So, why file analysis? This slide illustrates that file analysis runs through a series of common disciplines across whatever project you're engaged in. The core premise in file analysis, as I said just now, is you cannot protect or manage in any way information that you don't know anything about. And we're continually shocked by the number of organizations that continue to face this problem. It's going to be a problem for a long time. So I want to make very clear that the first mile in governance, in my view, is actually taking the act of understanding that data. So there's a 5-step process here which our software and similar types of software will execute. The first one is data discovery. This can be done really very quickly. Many terabytes a day. The software produces far more information than you as an organization can consume easily without the type of visualization that the software supports, and enables you to get a consistent view across all of your repositories, be they file share, SharePoint, or whatever. And the key here is a consistent view. You know, your policy obligations, your risk obligations, your retention obligations are the same regardless of where the data is stored. You'll still have to answer those fundamental questions. And so the fundamental job of a file analysis tool is to enable you to get a picture of all these data, and at scale as well. Let's not kid ourselves. Even if you examined 1 terabyte of data in your organization right now, that would be something like 1 million objects to deal with. That's more than a normal human, and any human could consider doing without the assistance of technology. And so when you consider the normal business situation where you've got 50, 100 terabytes or more of information, you know, the ability to scale is a key part of this process, and the ability to apply a rules-based methodology to let you typify the data and take decisions on it is a key part of the first mile. Off the top of understanding what that data is, the next step is to consider cleanup. There are 3 types of cleanup we typically recommend. First of all is getting rid of the redundant, obsolete, and trivial, again at scale. And secondly, dealing with the duplicates that come with that. Lastly, about understanding how you triage and manage data sensitivity and potential data responsive to privacy regulation. Data modeling and metadata tagging are related in that they enable you to match your classification rules against your types of content to ensure that you're generating the tags and the record classes that match up against your retention policies. And then the tagging process is critical in that it enables you to apply that model to the actual data. So you're generating a tag or a metadata set that can either be applied to the data in place or migrated with the data. And then this final step here in the file analysis process is the migration of the data either in place, labeling it and organizing it, or migrating it to a whole new repository. So those are the common steps on a file analysis tool should support you with. And before we move on to the next slide, the last point I make is this is an ongoing process. Our oil and gas customer in this situation adopted this as a model on an ongoing basis, applying it initially to customers that were seeking their support, but also embedding the process as part of business as usual, because you're continually creating new content, acquiring new businesses, acquiring new functions and reorganizing. And this continual cycle is part of a responsible governance process in all situations. Next slide, please. And so this last slide builds up into 3 clicks. If you can just hit the first one, please, Scott. What I want to use this slide for as my final point here is to illustrate that 5-step process I showed you just now shows you how sort of the general processes you step through in all projects. But these are the different use cases that you can then apply that to. And I think it's helpful to sort of consider when we're thinking about the first mile, the easy things you can do, which are the ones in the bottom left of the picture, where you have a relatively small amount of effort and an incremental improvement, along with the more transformational things you can do once you develop the practices and processes needed to deploy this type of thinking. So as you can see, cleaning up the trash in bulk is where most of our customers get started. Whether they're dealing with 10 terabytes, 100 terabytes, or a petabyte, they're using the software to classify data as trash, and then enabling the software against policy to execute on a quarantine and a cleanup process. And customers can remove between 30 and 70% historically of their data and file shares, for example, as a result of that. At the top left then, you have a general understanding process, which can be used when the business has a question such as where are my contracts in this data, or where are all my asset data for my oil and gas pipeline implementations. That's what the understanding process does. And then just above that, we can see identifying personal health information, PII data, and, for example, data subject to data privacy. The regulation has really made that a much more transformational activity. Next click, please, Scott. I'll slow down a little bit, and I won't talk to these all. The next types of use cases, we're good. Just click one, please, Scott. That's great.
So
these 4.
They both build out at once.
That's fine. These are good. So, and I've got one more after this, but we'll go to that in a second. These ones get more complicated. They're about identifying record classes and extracting metadata from them. They can be executed once the team of the implementation team in the organization has done a couple of laps of the earlier track in terms of understanding and deployment and cleaning up trash. Very quickly, you can move on to extracting metadata from the content, so it can be tagged and organized, mapping data to new structures so that you can migrate them either for storage or for into record classes. And then lastly, doing some sort of audit of acquired data. If you imagine our customer in this particular case was acquiring new businesses, one of the most important things you can do when you're acquiring new data is make sure you understand what it is, so you understand what information liabilities you're bringing on board. The last click, please, Scott. This last one here is the final point. So all of the previous blobs I put on the screen here could arguably be considered as one-off activities. But the key point that our customer learned in this case is that they have a continuing requirement to reapply this thinking on an ongoing basis. And so our software and many similar types of software enable you to apply these capabilities on an ongoing basis as part of a continuing obligation to monitor all of these things across your file shares, across your SharePoints, across any type of data repository. And I think that's the final point of the first mile, when you get your arm around how you continue to deploy these policies and refine them as part of business as usual.
Thanks for that, Rich, and it's a very nice lead-in to me talking about the last mile. I mean, you made a very good point that it's very important to use file analysis to actually determine what is important, and through the analysis that you provide, you can help organizations to get rid of the rot and ensure that the vital information, the important records, are retained. And I'm here talking about the last mile, but I just wanted to and we've kind of got this marathon analogy going here, and I just wanted to kind of correct one impression. You don't start a marathon to just finish before the last mile. The last mile, you start with the whole purpose of completing the marathon. So when you train for the full thing. And so that's kind of the analogy that I want to pull in here. And so what you're left with really when you begin your information management journey is there's always information that you're creating which is vital to your institution, and there are certain questions that you should be asking. Next slide, please, Scott. And going back, can you click on that? So going back to the example that Rich was talking about in the oil sector and the questions that this company was asking around, what do we need to retain for the long term and how do we need to differentially care for that? The important questions to ask really is what information is mission critical to the organization and can be considered long term. And in particular examples shown here are examples of things that have enduring value. And we live in this digital age now where it's not just documents that are digital, but pretty much everything that you conduct your business from. And there's some examples here that there are some very complicated digital objects that need to be kept for the long term. In this particular case, there are assets associated with land, rights and permits, pipeline infrastructure design, and then things relating to long-term occupational health and safety. In particular examples here around the need to keep these records findable and usable, not just for the engineering teams who need access to this information, but also to the legal team that needed to be able to look at this information from time to time and refer back to it. And in these particular examples, this information needed to be kept literally for decades because these assets are being used for decades. Oil wells and pipelines and so on, the life expectancy of those runs into decades, and so that this needs to be kept for that period of time. The other aspect associated with this whole area is how complex these digital objects are. And so increasingly these digital objects are not just simple files, but they're diverse and quite complex, particularly the engineering documents, and increasingly now the use of things like images and AV. I was recently at a conference where one of the big issues is how do we retain videos from drones taken for maintenance reasons. A big problem for folks concerned with keeping video content alive. And then a lot of data sets that relate to seismic and other things, and then of course spreadsheets and databases. So the issue is that a lot of this information is very, very complicated. It's very fragile in the sense that it relies on a technology stack, and that particular technology stack may not persist for decades. So the asset may need to exist, but the technology stack that created that asset in the very first instance doesn't exist. And that could be anything from the machine they use to capture the image, through to the way it's rendered, through to the way you interact with these objects. These are not static objects, these are complex digital objects. So the questions that clients in these regulated industries, which oil and gas is one tend to ask the questions as how mission critical are these? Do we need to keep them for a long time? And how diverse are these? Next slide, please.
And Mike, Scott here, I want to make sure and share now why Preservica and how Preservica helps address that need. So if I appreciate, I've got these complex file types, and I need to keep them a long time. Hit it home why Preservica in this use case.
Well, the particular examples here are that at any point in time, Scott, any parts of this technology stack may become redundant. It may be that your company's swapping out the systems that originally created these. One of the very common things in the oil and gas industry and the clients we work with experiences mergers and acquisitions where you're acquiring assets from another company. and you no longer support those particular applications, or in fact application decommissioning. That's a very, very common example. In fact, the client here that we're talking about had decommissioned something like about a dozen different systems over a period of about 20 years, and they were left with these assets. So those things become unreadable and unusable, not because the digital objects themselves are unimportant, but because the technology stacks that were not there. And the unique thing that active digital preservation does and Preservica does is we provide that file format transformation, the ability to render and use digital objects abstracted from the underlying technology stack. One of the important things that Rich described about what active navigation does is it helps to extract the right metadata and to ensure that the information is properly categorized. We take that a step further within Preservica by taking that information and allowing any additional metadata to be retained, and using some pretty advanced tools. For example, you can do metadata enhancement. So if there's any particular things that you need to record that were originally not captured with this, they can be retained. And the very important thing is the ability to render these and view and interact with these digital objects at some point in the future when you no longer have the applications. So that's the essential thing, Scott. You don't need the original application to render, read, and review these digital objects.
That's cool. We had a client not long ago have old files that they had to open, and they had to rebuild these old legacy systems, and even where do you find the software and hardware to run the old software, et cetera. And by advancing the files forward through active digital preservation, you eliminate that problem. That's so cool.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not just a future issue. Most people think of this as a future issue, as if I don't have that accumulated risk already. But in fact, the exact opposite is true, that many organizations will have that accumulated risk built within their organizations. And it's kind of in the bracket of it's kind of hard to deal with. So let's leave it sitting in an operational system. And it's not unusual to find in many organizations that these long-term records are inappropriately held in legacy applications, and just waiting for that moment when IT finally throws the switch and say, we're turning it off. Or even worse, IT might say, well, let's throw it into the cloud, and it's held in the cloud. That's not really addressing the issue of preservation, because that's really just keeping the bits in the cloud, not ensuring that the bits are readable and usable in decades to come.
So in that use case where you have a client with old assets around, how can you help them with Preservica there in that scenario?
Well, I think the key thing is as you go through, and this diagram here, I think shows how you need to think differentially around actively managing your files and then preserving them. So similar to Rich's continuum diagram of how you need to think in terms of actively managing your files and determining what is redundant and what needs to be retained. We think of preservation as a continuum. As you have your records management in place, you need to determine what is short-term and can be held in a content management system, but what is born archival. Let me put it that way. So you know that this is going to be of significant value to your organization, and it will have enduring value that will last decades, or it may have policies, retention policies, that determine it needs to be kept for decades, or it may have particular attributes associated with intellectual property or legal value, or some other enduring corporate value. For example, it might be the articles, engineering drawings absolutely associated with key things within your business, for example, and those should be actively preserved at the same time. And the technology now exists, and the solutions exist where you can manage that simultaneously with your enterprise content system. So when you're generating and keeping these systems in your SharePoint system or your OpenText or FileNet system, whatever records management system you use, you can automatically bring those into a system like Preservica and preserve those in place while still making them findable within the original content management system. So the key here is not to archive them too early, because archiving implies that they no longer have enduring value. But the key is to preserve them and ensure that over the lifetime of those records, if they're available for decades, that they're simultaneously preserved as well. And so that's the objective here. So you need to future-proof what you know is long-term. There's no point waiting until it's too late before you future-proof it. It's like buying insurance when your home has been robbed. There is no point in that.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting figuring out all the right words, and that's why I like your active digital preservation, because it's not just the keeping the bits, archiving, storing the bits, but having it preserved in a way that it's still a value for the enterprise. And
that's right, and many institutions understand this already. Certainly, for organisations in the academic and government sectors, I would say this is well understood, and many universities, many public sector organisations, who have to provide records for decades, understand this and do this now. I'd say in the corporate world, it's beginning to be understood. And the good news is that the technology now exists to make this automated. So active doesn't necessarily imply that you must be doing this actively all the time. In the same way that active navigations technology will allow you to automatically continue to manage your files, Preservica's technology will automatically ensure that these are the things that have enduring value can be automatically preserved. The next slide, Scott, kind of summarizes why you may want to do this, and keeping with the example of the the oil industry, the oil industry client that we talked about, the reasons there. The reasons shown here actually covered that particular example. In this particular case, it was an enduring corporate memory because there was mission-critical historical knowledge associated with the mergers and acquisitions of this organization that were pretty key to understanding what assets had been acquired over time, how those assets would fit within their overall strategy. And of course, that matters for the future as well for any acquiring organization that's acquiring the onward assets of those organizations. But the historical knowledge built up was pretty important. The key thing was legal and regulatory requirements, and there are many federal energy and regulation compliance type issues that address that energy companies are subject to, and the litigation for those, for not conforming to those can be quite severe. Indeed, privacy has been mentioned as well. So you need to ensure that the data is not just archived where you can't find the right information on any personal information, but you need to ensure that that carries through to your long-term preserved information. I've already mentioned this whole area of application rationalization, very, very common across many industries to rationalize applications and to ensure that information is kept. And the key thing is authenticity. We're living in an age now where it's very easy to duplicate and replicate information, and fake news is something we have to deal with in social media at the moment. But the ability to just take assets and re-render them and repurpose them and then claim they're original is very, very easy to do now. In regulated industries, it's vital that the original digital designs, documents, contracts, maintenance records, human resources records, that those actually can be demonstrated to have full provenance and authenticity. And so it's the evidential value of this which is pretty important as well. So
Yep.
Yeah. So in summary, the last mile we believe is as important as first mile, and plan your last mile at the same time you're planning your first mile is the message.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. You don't train for the marathon to start the marathon.
Yeah.
So, folks, what can you do after this webinar? Do you just say, well, that was an interesting hour with Mike and Rich and Scott, or is there actions you can take? So we'd recommend look at one thing you could do is you could use active navigation and you could look at a representative sample of your content out in the wild. So we can look at 5 terabytes or some number of content that you think is representative and crawl it with active navigation and analyze and understand what's in that content. And you might know that you have some skeletons in the closet, or you might know that you've got contracts or things that are of value that are stored where they're not supposed to be stored. We remember one client, an insurance client, well, you're not going to find any policy documents on SharePoint. Well, guess what we found, right? And so if you take a representative sample and crawl it and analyze it, get that reporting back, and now you actually know and you have data, you can help build your business case for doing a larger project or doing what you need to do there. Also, look at your content that is like what Mike talked about, that has that long-term preservation need and that you need to keep it around longer. And how are you going to prove the provenance? How are you going to open a CAD drawing with a version of CAD drawing that you can't even imagine exists yet because it's 10 years in the future, or you're opening a files and you have a lot of files that are made with old systems now. How can you properly manage and actively digital preserve that content? And also be looking at your privacy regs. We've talked about privacy quite a bit here, but man, if you're not reading up on keeping up with, say, the California Consumer Privacy Act, which goes live in January, and they're still defining the rules, fine-tuning the rules, make sure you're up on the privacy regs, and that is going to affect all of your digital content. I asked, talking to an attorney recently in Boston, and I asked her, like, we work with a lot of clients with content and file shares, and does this California Consumer Privacy Act really reach out to those Word documents and PDFs and audio files, et cetera? And she goes, all the way. And so it's important that you understand what you have. And if you're getting a data subject access request and you've got 30 days or 45 days to tell that person, validate that that person is the right person, and then tell that person all the data you have on them. Oh, and you got 1,000 requests in one day. How are you going to do that in 1,000 times across all your systems and properly respond to those digital subject or data subject access requests? You need to be prepared and have your content well governed end to end, like what we're talking about here. So let me take questions.
Mike, I was going to make a point if I could on that one.
Yeah, jump in, Rich.
Yeah, it's a little bit like sorry, Scott. My apologies, I keep tripping your name up. So Scott, it's a little bit the point Mike made, where organisations are surprised to find this stuff lying around, and the privacy point is really quite interesting. We've encountered plenty of organisations that will provide us a sample set and say, it's fine, that's clean, there's no sensitive data in there. And we've got to the point now where we want to run a bet with any organisation. We bet we can find stuff, and it's stunning the amount of information that we find which contains sensitive data where the organisation simply doesn't believe it's there. And I think it's an indication of the fact that technology systems don't best support users, and so users find workarounds, and this is when the information drifts out of control. And so I just want to just sort of that privacy point now is, if in the past organizations have felt they can kick this thing down the road, getting to the point where privacy regulation is drawing a line. And so don't assume that you've got your data under some degree of control. Our experiences, especially in places like file shares and SharePoint, that's not the case. And you can take some reasonable steps to just get started.
Yeah, for sure. We have a question here from Todd, and Rich, I think it goes to you. What percentage on average have you found to be automated versus manual? So Todd, I'm going to try to interpret your question. I think you're talking about what percentage of the content when we're doing a file analysis cleanup project can be automatically disposed. And so I suppose I could answer that, or Rich. But Rich, why don't you take it?
I'll get started, Scott. I think there are two parts to this question. It's got a lot. The first part is it's got a lot to do with the risk appetite of the business. We have met any number of information professionals who come into this with an expectation that they need to review every single document themselves. Let's be clear. If they do that, it's a very low percentage that can be automated, and your project will become too expensive and take too long to run. One of the reasons they feel they have to do that is because they're not being given the appropriate authority to act on the data, and that speaks to the way the organization and the project you're engaged in is appropriately supported by policy and the right sponsorship. So that's the people side. On the technology side, we divide, I consider it in three chunks. With the trash, Scott, you presented three classifications of trash, kind of the high confidence down to low confidence. You know, we have customers who are just beginning to automate disposal of high and medium confidence trash, and that's just beginning to happen right now. For things like sensitive data, there's a lot of scope for automating the sensitive data disposal. The capabilities and classification definitions that we use are getting pretty good, and you've got to consider what could go wrong here. And actually, when you think about file shares and the places we're finding this information, there's actually very little that can really go wrong. And so we're beginning to do that. For the records classes, that requires a little bit more support. And one of the areas we spend time thinking about is how do we scale up the review processes that enable record managers to be much more confident in records classification. And that requires more support. So if I was to put a percentage on it, you know, it kind of falls into those thirds, but it does depend on the use case you're deploying. So hopefully that answers, or at least helps answer that question.
Yes, thanks, Rich. I appreciate it. And, you know, numbers wise, you know, 20, again, there's so many variables. Your mileage will vary of policies and what you have, but 20%, 30% is usually a layup, and you're working harder when you're getting to 50%. You have that law of diminishing returns, of course. We have another question here. Let me read it here. Linda asked, the challenge many organizations face is migrating legacy information from old obsolete systems where the software is no longer supported. What are your recommendations for ensuring information is available long-term? So Mike, I think that'd be your question there. What can you do to ensure it's available long-term?
Well, I think the first thing, Linda, is to run those files through a tool like Preservica that can immediately characterize those files for you. So if you're sitting on lots of files that you can't read, a tool like Preservica can immediately do something called characterization. That's forensically looking at the files, forensically identifying what systems they originated in, extracting all the technical metadata associated with that, extracting the descriptive metadata, and wherever possible, rendering that information. Immediately on doing that, you can work out what size of problem you have. Are these truly redundant files that need to be transformed and migrated into a new format, or are they simply files that you haven't got readers for, but there are extant readers available? Now, something like Preservica can help you immediately render and view those files, or determine that there's a migration policy that needs to be carried out on those. Now, the good news is that migration policies to new formats is a very, very well understood science now, and we have many of those workflows automated within Preservica that can suggest to you immediately, oh look, this is an old Lotus Notes file, you can't read it anymore, we can translate it to Open Word, and here you go, and it will actually show you the fidelity of that, so you can immediately look at it and you can say, okay, I can look at the fidelity of that, and that is acceptable, or that is perfectly, that's a perfect rendition of that particular file. So there are, you know, a tool like Preservica can recognize over 900 different file formats and hundreds of different workflows. So this sort of thing can become very easy. But the first thing is understand the size of your problem. It may not be as big as you think if you can immediately use a preservation tool to size it and scope it.
Yeah, Thank you. I appreciate that. Sorry, I jumped around the slides there a bunch just now. We're at the hour, and I'm gonna close out and say that, this has been a great conversation on what we should do and need to do and key considerations. And I would imagine for some of the folks on the line that a picture is worth 1,000 words. If anybody would like a demonstration of one of these tools, just reach out to us and let us know. And we'd be happy to arrange a demonstration of active navigation or Preservica or both, and whichever one you think might fit your need there, and just to learn more about it. We'd be happy to set that up. And Annalisa, anything else we need to do before we close out here?
Nope, just a quick reminder that we'll be following up via email with a link to the recording as well as the deck. And as Scott said, just feel free to reach out to anyone with individual questions. And thank you for joining.
Awesome. This has been a lot of fun. Rich and Mike and Annalisa, thank you very much. And everybody have a great Tuesday.
Thank you. Thank you.